So in this video, I'm going to be talking about Theme 2, and we're going to be going over some revision on the key themes in Theme 2. Now, I'm not going to be able to cover every single part of the syllabus, but I'm going to highlight certain parts that I think are most important to look at. So from using the video, you will then need to go back and look at some extra parts on top of this as well. Let's start. I want to discuss very quickly the difference between real and nominal, because this comes up a lot in Theme 2. You'll notice in questions they use words real income versus nominal income. So what does it mean? Well, if anything has the word real in front of it, it means it has taken into account inflation. So real income increase means that income has gone up once we've taken into account inflation. Nominal means that we haven't taken into account inflation. So if I say my income has gone up by 5%, and that's the nominal amount, that means it's just gone up by 5%. I'm not taking into account what's going on with inflation. Now, where might you find real numbers? You might find them in terms of real income. You might find it in terms of real government spending. You might find it in terms of real exports. So if we say, what's the total value of all the exports in the UK? What's the real value? We're looking at it in terms of inflation being taken into account. So if you think about it, if I've got a choice between looking at the real numbers versus the nominal numbers, I should always use the real numbers, because nominal numbers don't really tell you the whole story. If I'm not taking into account inflation, I don't really know if something has increased in value or not. So real is always better to use than nominal. I'll give you an example. If I say average real income in the UK has gone up by 6%, so that means that income after we've taken into account inflation has gone up by 6%. So that means on average, even with inflation, people are 6% richer. So that's good. If I say nominal income has gone up by 6%, well, that's very misleading, because we don't know what rate inflation might be. If nominal income going up by 6%, that could happen what would happen if inflation was 8%? That would mean actually people are getting poorer. If inflation is above the nominal number, that means that the value is actually going down, not up. So real has already taken into account inflation and is the better value to always use. We shouldn't really ever use nominal because it's very misleading. Now, looking at the graph here, you can see when we look at Theme 2, it's all about the whole economy. And when we're talking about supply and demand in an economy, we are talking about AS and AD. We still have an equilibrium point, but instead of S and D, we're looking at AS and AD. Now, I just want to point out to you that on the axes for the graph, we've got price, as we normally do, but here, they like you to use the word output. So that means the amount of goods and services either being bought or produced in your economy. So use output. You can put GDP in brackets if you like. Now, what causes that AD here to go up and down? Well, in basic terms, we've got the equation. Consumption plus investment plus government spending plus exports minus imports. So what can cause AD to go up or down? Any one of these. Now, I will cover these in a bit more detail in a later video, but essentially, if any of these go up, then AD goes up, except for imports. Imports going up is a bad thing. We don't want that. So if C, I, G, or X go up, AD goes up. If C, I, G, X go down, AD goes down. But if imports go up, AD goes down. If imports go down, AD goes up. So all of these are important factors when it comes to working out AD. Now, if you had to choose one, the one that has the highest value and is the most important, it's this one, C, consumption, because that's the total amount of money being spent by consumers in your economy. And if you think about how many millions of people there are in the UK, that's a huge amount of money that these consumers are spending. So C is the most important, but all of them are important in their own way. Now, let's look a bit more at AS. Now, when we look at this graph here, this is short run aggregate supply. We'll look at long run in a minute, but short run is like this. It acts exactly how AD does. Now, with theme 2, AD is always changing, and short run aggregate supply is always changing. But what causes it to change? Well, staff wages. If the minimum wage, for example, goes up, that means on average businesses are going to have to spend more money. That means their costs are going up, so supply will go down. Cost of raw materials going up or down, that has a big effect on AS. So when we talk about raw materials, we generally talk about the big raw materials that affect most people. So electricity costs, for example, or oil, petrol, that type of thing. Technology is a third one. Improvement in technology can enable firms to produce more units cheaper. So that is going to affect aggregate supply, at least in the short term. And finally, taxes and subsidy changes. If tax goes up, so for example, when we're talking about tax and aggregate supply, you have to be specific and mention taxes that affect businesses, so corporation tax, VAT, for example. If corporation tax goes up, that means that's more money that a business is having to spend. That's an extra cost. Therefore, they will reduce their supply. If a subsidy goes up, then that lowers the cost for a business, so aggregate supply will go down. So the main factors that affect short-run aggregate supply are these four here. Now in the exam, they will be very specific. If they want you to talk about long-run, they will mention long-run aggregate supply. There's no such thing as long-run aggregate demand. So they will mention, if they want you to talk about long-run, they will specifically mention it. But if they just talk about AS in general, they mean short run, the usual one that we look at. So let's look at long run very quickly. There are two types of long run aggregate supply. You can draw the classical or you can draw the Keynesian. The classical one is just a straight line. So think of classical, it means just a straight classical line. Now the Keynesian one is slightly different. It's a curved one. So what is the difference and why they like this? Well, if we start with the classical one, what this is showing us, this is long run supply, it is showing us that it doesn't matter what happens to the price of products in your economy. It doesn't matter what happens to demand, whether demand would be cutting the supply line down here, or here, or here, or here. Supply is always fixed. It's always fixed in the long term. So with classical aggregate supply, it assumes that businesses are working at full capacity. And even if they wanted to, they wouldn't be able to produce more supply. So even if demand went up, even if the price went up, supply is fixed in this one position. Now that doesn't mean that supply can't, the line itself cannot move left and right. It can do, but something very large would have to happen in your economy for that to occur. So day to day, long run supply is fixed. That's why it's like that. So it doesn't matter what is happening to aggregate demand, supply, the amount being supplied will stay the same in the long run. This is different though in Keynesian. You'll notice here that in Keynesian there are differences. supply can go up. So if demand started here, at where the cursor is, if demand went up to here, can you see that that has actually increased the amount being produced? So with Keynesian, it doesn't assume that businesses are always working at full capacity. It assumes that businesses generally will have some sort of spare capacity, at least to start off with. And as demand rises more and more and more, the business will use its spare capacity to meet that demand. But at some point, even if demand keeps going up and up and up, there will come a point, just like classical, where it will meet the maximum. There will be a maximum that supply can be at. So both of these graphs do end up at the same point. They do end up with the straight line, but with Keynesian, you start off having some spare capacity and then you get to your maximum capacity. But with classical, you're already at maximum capacity and you cannot produce any more. Now, there are ways to shift long-run aggregate supply, but these are things that must happen in the economy that are very large changes. So they're not small things, they're things that would affect the economy for a long time in the future. They're going to affect it for years and years and years. So for example, if generally in your economy your workers are becoming more educated, better training, we've got better quality schools and a better quality workforce, that will increase supply in the long term because better workers means they can produce more. A second thing is if generally in your economy over a long period of time the work ethic and the motivation amongst your workers increases, then that is also going to make them to work harder, more efficiently, which means supply will increase. More enterprise means that we're encouraging more people to set their own businesses up. More businesses means more being produced, which means more supply. Better infrastructure and increases in technology, both of these things allow more supply to be created in the long term. So any one of these can increase long-run aggregate supply, but it takes a very long time for it to happen. So simply building new universities is not going to increase long-run supply straight away. There is going to be what we'd call a time lag. It's going to be a difference between when you build them and then a few years before things really start to actually happen. That's the end of the first video, and I'll be back with some more revision for theme 2.